Good morning and welcome to the Dungeon Musings Podcast. My name is Kevin Madison and I will be your friendly dungeon muser today. Today, I want to talk about designing one-shot adventures. So things that you're either going to run to highlight a game system, something you might want to run at a con, or something that you're doing for any other reason. Something where you just want to fill up an evening with something a little different from the usual. I've been thinking about this quite a bit this week after seeing the really terrific anthology series, Love, Death, and Robots. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So let's get to the episode. All right, so to frame this discussion, what I want to talk about first is something that the writer Kurt Vonnegut had written about doing short stories. And he had, internet famously set out 8 different rules for structuring short stories, because short stories are different, from not only, are they just shorter than like a novel or a novella or something like that. Short stories have a different structure. There's a much tighter period in which you've got to convey the story, like everything that's going to be happening within the context of that piece. So he set 8 different rules, and while obviously role-playing games are not fiction, I think there are some really important lessons that can be drawn from these 8 different rules. So the 8 rules are: number 1, use the stranger's time well. Make sure you're making use of whoever's reading the short story. Make sure that it's not wasting their time with extraneous stuff. No fluff, no whatever. Give them what is necessary for the actual story. Number 2, give the reader a character they can root for. So they've got to have someone to be invested in. Number 3, every character should want something. So it should be clear what the character actually wants. There's an adage that the drama comes from the contest of a character's wants or the conflict between their wants and needs. And that's something that's worth examining. As an aside, the most recent Legend of the Five Rings role-playing game put out by Fantasy Flight actually expressly incorporates a mechanic like that, and it's really, really fucking cool. Anyway, so every character should want something. Rule number 4, every sentence should reveal character or advance action. Now, obviously, that's not directly applicable to role-playing games, but it speaks to using your time wisely. Number 5, start as close to the end. This is a really important one for role-playing, and I think is particular for one-shots. Number 6, be a sadist. Make bad things happen. People want to read these short stories because they want to see the characters go through something, so do something really terrible. Similarly for characters in a role-playing game. Make sure that the session is about something. In that way, do horrible shit to the players so they can get themselves out of trouble. Number 7, write to please one person. This one is not necessarily just applicable to role-playing, or rather to short stories, but game design in general. One of the things that you hear over and over again when you see developers talk about designing their video games is, having a strong authorial intent behind them. So, and I think that's true for role-playing games as well, too. Just in general, in the sense that, having a strong authorial voice in your game that will really please some and really piss off some others, or not necessarily piss off, but just it won't be for some people and it will be for some. That makes for a much stronger and more memorable game, I think. In addition, that applies to your one-shot too. Make sure it's about, like if you've got a voice, if you've got a style that you want to run for this, do it. Go, really lean into it so that it is a memorable session. And if it isn't for some of the players, presumably you're going to be, at a con, you can't necessarily predict that, but presumably if it's for a home game, you're going to be able to get a sense of whether something is really not going to be for one of your players. But, it still is more important to have that strong voice. If 1 out of your 5 players really doesn't like it because it's just not for them, but the other 4 absolutely love it, well, then I think you've done your job then. Or at least you've done as close to your job as can be reasonably expected. Maybe that's a contentious statement, but whatever. The final one, Rule 8, give as much info as soon as possible. To hell with suspense. This one I might take issue with. I'm going to add 2 other rules as well, and these are with respect to the role-playing games, because presumably what you're doing with your one-shot is that you're going to be trying to run something that you don't normally run, or you're trying to you run an aspect of that game that you don't normally explore or something. Like there's some reason why you're choosing to do that. And it may very well be that you're introducing new people to a new game, be that at a con or, your players to a new game system. In that case, then what I would think that I'd add is number 9 and number 10. Number 9, pick the elements of the setting that make you the most excited. And number 10, so that's number 9, and then number 10, pick the elements of the mechanics that make you the most excited. That's the rules. That's rules 1 through 10. Let's kind of go through those things in, maybe what I'll do is I'll break up the next segment into a block of 5 rules and 5 rules and try and organize the conversation that way. So that's the rules. All right, so let's talk about the first one first here. So use the stranger's time well. Obviously, that's, the stranger in this case is your players. Make sure that the players are actually doing stuff the whole time. One of the things, this is going to relate to some of the choices you'll make in Rule 9 and Rule 10, but make sure that what you're choosing to make the session about is a meaningful thing. It's not I think one of the things that I had to have done in the past, and I have stopped doing now, is running one-shots as effectively like segues into a potential ongoing campaign. I will routinely use cliffhangers or things like that at the end of it. I'll tell a half story. I did one kind of mashup that was using D&D 5th to run a kind of Old West steampunky Star Wars thing, and then I effectively ended the session with the Death Star destroying Alderaan, or the sort of steampunk equivalent thereof. And I don't think that was not a great way to end that, largely because it didn't, the players felt like they just did the first act of an overall story. I think what I should have done is structured it so that they were actually, able to do the full session. It wasn't just one small little thing that was a part of a much bigger, and the better part of the story would be happening later. So that's one thing, is make sure you're making use of the time. Whatever is happening in that particular session, make sure that it's going to be it's going to make, they're not going to feel like they've wasted their time, or they only have part of a story. And that's, to do that, what you need to do is figure out what your use of time is going to be. If it's a 4-hour session, then you plan for that 4-hour session. What am I going to do in the first hour? What's going to happen in the next 2 hours? What's the big finale going to be in that final hour? If you've got 8 hours or 6 hours, similarly, to break out your time and figure out what's going to be happening in those sessions. Depending on the role-playing game you're running, be mindful of the fact that combat tends to take longer than anything else. And also rules explanation as well too. With a one shot, if it is a game that does have complicated rules, or you have players who are not going to be familiar with the rules, so not only the setup, the setting, the characters are you going to have to explain, you're also going to have to explain the rules. You're going to make sure that you're making good use of their time. One of the ways to do that is to steal an idea from video games and just incorporate the learning of the rules as part of that actual session. Find ways to show them how they're going to be making skill tests in the game. Show the ways that how they're going to, figure out what their abilities or what their stats mean in the game. Video games do this really, really well, and a lot of the more recent, actually, what a great example is the Fantasy Flight box sets. So if you happen to have any of the Star Wars introductory box sets, or the Legend of the Five Rings introductory box set, those all do a really terrific job of walking the players through the setting, the world, and then learning the mechanics one step by one step. And in that way, you're making sure that they're making good use of their time. Any time that's spent is not just sitting around talking about the mechanic. You're actually implementing it. So that's one rule, is make sure you're making use of their time well. Give them a character they can root for. And to do that, you got to really highlight what's really cool about the characters. More often than not, you're going to be using pre-gens in a one-shot, which means the characters, or players rather, are coming into this fresh. So make sure the characters are the coolest kind of thing that you could hope for in that setting. You're not showcase what makes you excited about that game, both in terms of the character and in terms of the setting. So, like, one of my favorite things in Star Wars games is Mon Calamari, because the Mon Calamari accent is a pretty easy one to do without really offending anybody, because you just gotta kind of make your voice sound like this, and I love doing it. It's funny, so I introduce a lot of Mon Calamari in my game, and in some one-shots as well, too. So I ran a one-shot one time that was it was a request for a player for his birthday, and he wanted to play Suicide Squad. And so what I did is to give them an opportunity to play the characters the way that, and have the same experience that's in the Suicide Squad comics. This is well before the movie came out. I sat down specific things that were signature character things that the players needed to do in the course of the session. They said, this is your task, your checklist. So, the guy who was playing King Shark had to eat someone at a dramatically inappropriate time. The guy who was playing Captain Boomerang had to betray them in a way that was going to be obvious and easily caught, and so forth. So we set out different ways. The guy who was playing Bizarro had to do, I can't remember what it was, speak in, or try and interpret the instructions or requests from other players in the most obtuse way he could. Kind of like wishes in AD&D. So that's another way of like, those guys knew exactly what they were doing, not only mechanically with their characters, but also story-wise with their characters. They knew who these characters were, and they immediately had a reason to have fun role-playing with them, be it, a silly Mon Calamari accent, or be it a funny character trait, or whatever. So not just giving them interesting mechanical abilities that they may have, give them really good reasons to just chomp their, sink their teeth into the pre-gen character they're going to play, and have them understand what they're going to be doing with that character, what's going to be fun about playing that character. Number 3, every character should want something. This ties into that last point, where make it clear what the characters want. For a one-shot, you don't need to fuss around with trying to you're meeting at the bar, we're going to wait for you to get your quest. You can just tell them what they're there for. There's no need to fuss around. There's no need to go through everyone knows they're there for a limited time. So jump right into it. One of my favorites of those shorts from Love, Death, and Robots is one called Soul Sucker, and it starts off with this guy running along. It's an older guy who, like a much older guy who's kind of an old professor type, and there's another guy who looks like a big brawny, military type. And the big brawny military type, they're running along this old corridor, and the big brawny guy says to the other guy, the old guy, "Is that who I think it was? There's no way it could be what I think it was." And that's a fucking great way to start a game, and start a game session, or start a piece of short fiction, or short media, I should say. Because I immediately I care about these characters because they're in jeopardy. I want to know what the hell it is, and I already know from the tone that it's something really crazy and important. So that was awesome, and that's a good example that they've got something to care for. They need to get the hell out alive. I don't need to be told their backstory. You find, at least not at that point, I don't need to be. I find out more about it as we go on, but it's a terrific example of, how you just make it clear what the character wants. So every character, make sure they've got something that they want, because then the players will know what they're doing in that session as well. And that can be to check off the, my Suicide Squad checklist, or it can be something like, that they want to recover something. If there's a MacGuffin that the characters are going to be looking for in this particular session, then, make it clear that that's what they're doing. You're here to, I recently ran a one-shot that was set in the plane of Innistrad, the gothic horror setting from Magic Gathering. And I made it clear from the outset, the guys are there because they're chasing this vampire who stole something important. And that's as much sort of context as we needed for that particular session. Another way to telegraph both the want and the character want, or rather the character want, and then a reason to root for the character, is to give them something they can do. Get similar to my Suicide Squad checklist. In the one-shots that I ran for Astonishing Swordsmen and Sorcerers of Hyperborea, I ran one for a con, and I ran one for a charity session. What I did is set out a reason, if the character did or said, X, Y, Z, then they would regain a point of astonishing fortune. And that's my kind of like, in-game meta currency that they could use to adjust dice rolls and things like that. And that's another way of them understanding their character without me having to write a big backstory or something like that. It was that, you get a point when you, as the barbarian, rail against the use of sorcery, or when you down an enemy or adversary who use sorcery and you bellow out, some kind of triumphant thing. Or whatever, or you talk about the degeneration of civilized man or something like that, the weakness of whatever. And those are just ways that not only does it give benefit to the player mechanically, it also gives them an easy shorthand for like, oh, this is what this character is intended to be about. So it's a quick way for them to wrap their heads around that. The box set for Legend of the Five Rings actually does a pretty good job of that too, because they one of the mechanics in there is playing up your character's kind of personality, and they give you really clear ways for doing that in there. So that gives you a way to want. Next up is every sentence should either reveal character or advance action. Now, in a role-playing game, obviously you're not, unless you are a massive fan of, text or boxed text, the kind of stuff you see that you're supposed to read aloud in modules, you're probably not going to be reading an awful lot from the adventure. But I mean, if what you would prefer to do is for certain key segments in it, write out the text, no problem with that at all. You just, make it sound like you're interesting and engaging when you're reading it. That's all. But anyway, what I take from that lesson or that rule is that everything that happens in the session should be important. There shouldn't be any spinning wheel stuff. Like for me, I have a really bad habit of, if the players are doing something in the session, even though it's not necessarily related to the actual adventure they're on, and everyone's having fun, like if they're talking to an NPC, or they're, I don't know what, like, they're really involved in buying stuff, or I don't know. Usually it's talking to an NPC that I didn't think was going to be important. I not often let that run. But in a one-shot, though, what I do is I try to make sure that everything that's happening in that has some purpose. It doesn't allow you to do to be as free-form as you can in some other types of games. Like a sandbox is really tricky to run as a one-shot, in the sense that if you're going to run it as a beginning, middle, and end story, but or at least a complete story, and not just you wander out, stuff happens, and then it's done. That's just home movies. That's not a story. But what you can do is make sure that everything that's happening, every interaction with NPCs, everything everything they encounter, all of that stuff serves a larger purpose, which is to make for a tight and engaging experience, something that makes the very best use of the time that you have at the table, and makes for the best short gaming experience you can. It's actually pretty liberating too once you do that, because you've got a kind of battle plan of how you're going to get through that session then, and that's a really good way to remorselessly or ruthlessly at least cut the fat from your story, from whatever you're planning on doing in that one session, be it uncover an ancient vampire's weapon or something like that, or be it explore a lost space station. That really helps you figure out, all right, do I need this? And that's actually one way of thinking about this, thinking about these particular things. If you're like me as a DM, you're going to add stuff and improv stuff anyway. So you're going to have stuff that's going to take a little longer than you expect. So if you approach it from the perspective that you are never going to get through as much as you hope, that you're going to have to cut stuff, then at best what you're going to do is just be a ruthless editor, not the author of it, and cut the stuff you just don't need. If it isn't necessary for the session, it isn't necessary to demonstrate the tone, the features you want to highlight in it, be it the mechanics or the setting, whatever it is, if it's not needed, if it's not necessary to get to that end, then you really should strongly consider cutting it, because you should have only the very strongest stuff in the one shot. It's not like a ongoing campaign where, like, if you have a looser session, you can always make it up and make better headway in the next session. It's this is it. We're in, we're out, and that needs to be a very tightly scripted experience if you want to have if you want to make the best use out of that time. And then finally, number 5 for this segment, start as close to the end. I love this bit of advice, and it's, to be honest, I had to look up most of the other rules when I was preparing for this segment, but that one has always stuck with me. And watching Love, Death, and Robots really reminded me, I'm like, oh yeah, these guys get it. Like, they fucking get that you don't need to do here's the preamble and here's the whatever. There's maybe one or two of those stories that is, I feel like a little more in Love, Death, and Robots that are a little more padding at the start of the thing. I think that the tone they were going for with those particular shorts, it's the one about the artist robot and the one about the yogurt taking over. Those ones, I mean, they have a bit of a different oddball tone to them, but I think for the purpose of like a role-playing game, at least a one-shot role-playing game, which is presumably going to be embracing some aspects of combat, of role-playing, of exploration, then you're going to want to not do that. You're going to want to look to, the model of the, what's it called? Soul Suckers, or my favorites were from that particular thing were Sunny's Edge and Shapeshifters. Those two are just, wow. Like they do an amazing job of immersing you in that world immediately, getting you incredibly invested, and then bringing you through the ringer, with those characters. Those characters go through an incredible arc in the course of the 6 to 17. I think those ones are actually a little longer, probably about 15 minute. But it's a 15-minute short film, and they're like you absolutely care about those characters. You absolutely care about the environment. They feel like a fully fleshed world without having to go through a bunch of nonsense, exposition at the start. And they start right near the end. They start right up as things are about to be fucking, crazy. And that's a great way of thinking about your design for one-shot adventures. I've been adopting that for about a year and a half or 2 years now with my one-shots, and I find it really helps me to figure out, what I need to do to make those sessions really important, to have the characters suddenly like, holy shit. And, inadvertently, that's actually a lesson I should have fucking known for my campaigns as well, because I've had 2 different campaigns that have started this year. At the time of recording, it's 2019, and one of the sessions, or one of the campaigns, I started just like that. It's boom, players washed up on a beach, they were shipwrecked, and they were lost in the middle of this tundra, and they needed to find a way to survive. And that was it. Boom, here we go. This is what's happening. Let's go. No prologue, no time on the ship, none of that nonsense. And it was awesome. Like players picked up and were running with it right away. I wish I could say that was necessarily planned that way. It just sort of happened that felt like the right way to start it. And holy crap, did it ever. Like it wasn't important what happened on the ship. It wasn't important how the characters got to that specific point. What was important is they got no food, they've got no shelter, and they don't know where the hell they are, and they're full of, in the middle of wilderness that is full of dangerous things. So so that's one good example. In contrast, my Delta Green campaign spent about 3 sessions navel gazing of setting up character and setting up suspense, and I really did not do a very good job of getting engagement, or at least the level of engagement I think I could have got. One of the parts of the session was pretty good. Like, I think the way I initially started with this tense scene of one player's character dying, that was, I think, pretty good. But then I just lost the train, and like everything else was much more boring and more just characters talking. And like when you're playing a game that I have billed as, Delta Green, or as X-Files meets Call of Cthulhu, well, they were getting neither of those things in those sessions. And what I should have done is filled that shit in as backstory as we went through the session, not starting every session with parts of a backstory. Like, it just didn't do I think I could have done a much better job than I did with that thing. So, that's obviously something I chalk up to me, but I mention it only as a way of saying that, like, some of these rules, they don't necessarily have to wait for you to run one-shots either. Like, some of these are equally applicable to ongoing campaigns, and it's good rules to figure out how to structure those. And before I go on to the next segment too, it's worth noting that, there is a school of thought out there that thinks like, why don't we run every session like as if it's as if it's a as if it is a convention one shot. We take all this time and care to really make for the campaign one shots, to make them incredibly exciting and engaging and whatnot. Why don't we do the same thing with our at-home games? Why aren't we treating every single session of those campaigns as that precious, as that important of a time investment? So anyway, let's rules number 1 through 5. Let's transition into segment 2 or 3, whatever, and talk about rules 6 through 10. All right, so the next rule is rule number 6: be a sadist. And this, what I take it to mean, is to really put the players, or the characters, I should say, through the ringer. And this is, again, a really, really important one because, a one-shot is presumably going to be that's going to be the extent of the involvement with those characters. And the way that you make people care about those characters is by putting them in jeopardy, right? I think by putting those, or part of the way, your session should, whether it's about social interaction, whether it's about physical combat, whether it's about averting the destruction of the world, whatever, make it a insanely difficult thing. Make it, or at least a monumentally, eventful thing. I ran a one-shot years ago for my birthday, where I had each of the players playing a multiversal version of Green Lantern. We just used the Green Lantern stats for it, but I had the players each come up with pick one of the existing Green Lanterns. At the time, it was only the guys, so it was Hal Jordan, John Stewart, and Guy Gardner. And then I had them create a multiversal version of that character. They could be from a gladiator world, they could be from a dinosaur world, they could be whatever, And so each of them, all the players made up their backstory for the characters. They all had relatively the same stats, but we made up their characters, and then we sat down, and then what the stakes for the session were that they were from the only surviving multiverse, only surviving universes of the entire multiverse. The old character Monarch was actually basically trying to go for ultimate power by condensing every universe in on itself to pull all of the versions of himself into himself. So, an infinite amount of power coalesced into one singular form. And those are some pretty fucking big stakes, and once the players realized those were the stakes, it made for a really fun and meaningful session. I mean, like the fact that they were the only, and actually we had, it was great because we had one player who could only make half the session, so I'd worked out with him ahead of time, like, don't worry, I'm going to kill you. And we had one of those, they dwindled down from 5 remaining Green Lanterns to 4 remaining Green Lanterns, and then at that point, all the elements of his particular universe, I think he was the one from the dinosaur universe, all of those faded from view. Like they were in a kind of an amalgam universe that had elements of each of the 5 surviving universes all pulled together. The last gasp of the collapse of the multiverse, if you will. And and then that again also like really raised the stakes. And that made for a really memorable session. Both for the players and for myself and for the viewers, because I streamed that one as well too. So when you are planning for your one shot as well, think of what's the most trouble I can get my characters in? What's the most ridiculous threat they can face? You don't need to worry about balance as much, because then you're never going to see these characters again anyway. So if what you need to do is introduce something over the course of that one shot to allow the characters to actually deal with that scale of threat, well then fine, that's fine. You don't need to worry about the later consequences of that, but make it big. Make it as big as you possibly can. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to destroy the destroy the world. Like, they could be the last survivors of a Arctic expedition. They could be a family member, or people who have their last can of food in a zombie apocalypse. and that they need to go out and face it. Like that's as big a threat. They may be all dying of a terminal illness, some kind of radiation sickness or some other, fantasy or what do you call it, some sci-fi MacGuffin. Make it big, and then big can be personal as well as universal. So just figure out whatever it is that's going to be big for your world. Think of the stuff you could never get away with in an ongoing campaign. Have Waterdeep torn to pieces by zombies. Have dragons raise or the dragon raise Tyr to the ground. Have it suck all the souls and have your characters lost in the wilderness. As long as that's a good starting point, I guess. As long as there's a story there as well too, something that they can get engaged with. That they're not wasting their time. Getting back to rule 1, make it big and put them through the ringer. They will thank you for it afterwards. It's like a good workout. They're going to feel great afterwards. They may not enjoy the shit kicking they're going to get as they go through it. Okay, so then rule 7. Right to please one person. Again, this is not necessarily something specific for a one-shot, but, go big with your ideas for the one-shot. It's got to be something memorable. So for the one-shot, make it something that you care about, that you think is interesting. And the players may, if they don't, that's fine. Failed experiments are much better than not trying for them. And I lately have been approaching my one-shots with the perspective of can I do this in a one-shot? Can I take this idea and make it work in a one-shot? And you'd be surprised how often you can make satisfying one-shots with those wild ideas. You do have to do some work. You do have to apply a lot of these other rules to remorselessly cut stuff out. But you can do that. You can introduce and achieve a lot more in those one-shots than you can. But you want to have a strong voice on it. An example of that is, so one of my Astonishing Swordsmen and Sorcerers of Hyperborea games, the one-shot, first one I ran, actually, I decided to write a whole bunch of my own canon stuff. I made the setting for that story be the last outpost of Atlantis. Now, I don't, there's not hard and fast rules about Atlantis in the setting material, the canon setting material, but for me, that was a really interesting buy-in and a great way to make make the stakes, make it important, not only because it was, the things that the characters were facing and it were really impressive and important, but knowing that they were, by achieving their goals, by surviving this encounter, they were destroying the last true remnants of Atlantis. I had a player who said, I'm almost a little sad that this is happening. And that's awesome. That's exactly what I had in mind. I'm I want it to be both exciting and a big thing, but also a little sad that we're seeing the end of an age, with by the end of the session. And it was stuff that the players didn't give a shit about at the start of the session. So that I think was a successful session. And that was because I was being true to it. Someone who is a purist, who wanted to see only stuff that was true to canon and that wasn't rewriting or not necessarily rewriting, but adding a bunch of stuff that was not necessarily implicit in the setting. That was me leaning into my authorial, voice. That was me having a clear voice for what I wanted to do with that session. So that's it, right to please one person. And then rule 8, give as much info as soon as possible. To hell with suspense. For a one-shot, I agree with this. Now, that's not to say that you cannot reveal stuff over the course of an adventure. I've had good one-shots that have been sort of exploring the character as we go. But I think I agree with this. I think that you don't want to be, you want to be introducing, because you've got limited time, introduce that information as you go. If you need to tell the players that they've been hired to do X job by, Y Space Corporation, and that they expect XYZ problems there, just tell them that. This is what's going on. You're probably not going to be playing a one-shot with people who have never played before. And if you do, that's going to help them. If they're players who have played before, they're going to know, all right, this is what we're doing in this session. Here's what we're spending our time doing. If they've never played role-playing games before, then this is going to be a helpful way to help them understand what the heck the next 4 to 6 to 8 hours is going to be about. So, give as much as soon as possible, but do it in the because it's a game. Do it in as engaging and as fun a way as possible. Start as close to the end of the story, and don't waste their time. Introduce only what's necessary. Don't add, what I will say is, in terms of the info, don't give them trivia. Give them stuff they need to know for the purpose of that story, that session. If elves have something really cool in your setting or the setting you're playing in, but it's not going to come up in that story, don't tell them about it. Don't incorporate it. It doesn't matter. What matters is whatever you've chosen to bring to that session, which gets us, I guess, to rule 9. Rule 9 is pick the elements of the setting that you really want to highlight, the stuff that you love. The things that that really made you pick up and want to run this game in terms of what's in the setting. That could be the type of characters you could play. That could be types of adventures you get on. That could be the settings itself. Could be a Star Trek game. Could be a Star Wars game. Whatever is the cool stuff in the setting. Pick the stuff you really think is the best and incorporate that in your story, because that will, or your one shot, that will allow the players to see and experience the stuff that you think is the most exciting about that. If you think, say, Vampire Dark Ages is the coolest thing about that is, the whatever clan, the Lasombra clan at that time, the Cappadocian clan at that time. God, they're cool. I love them. I can't wait to, that's an element of the setting that I really love. Well, put that in. Put that thing in your story. Figure out how you're going to get that in there and make sure you make use of that. If you think the travel rules, now let's get to the mechanics. That's rule 10 is the mechanics. One Ring is a game I'm going to be running coming up pretty soon. It's got some really, really interesting travel rules. Travel, just like in Tolkien's stories, has, it's a big part of the game. It is really has flavorful rules and allows the characters to make some interesting decisions and have interesting experiences over the course of the travel. That's a really cool part, so I really want to make sure that's a mechanic that sees its way to the table in my one-shot for that. And if you've got another mechanic, like, say, I don't know, like there's, in Blades in the Dark, the planning of heist mechanics, that's really cool. So I always include that when I run Blades in the Dark as a one-shot. If you like random encounters, if you're playing a version of D&D that has random encounters or random, uses morale mechanics, and that's something you find cool, and the players are used to other versions of D&D that don't have morale, 3rd edition going forward. Well, then incorporate that in there. When they see that one good hit results, you dropped one of you dropped the chieftain of the ogre tribe, and then, the DM turfed the morale check, and they see them all run away. Well, that's awesome, and you can tell the players, look, I let the dice fall where they may. It just so happens that this worked out. That helps the players see in play a mechanic that you really wanted to highlight. So when you're planning your one-shots, that's another thing to keep in mind. What's the mechanical stuff that I want to highlight? And I guess conversely also, what are you going to have to deal with? If you've got a really complicated system, like here's an example. When I read the beta version of the most recent version of Legend of the Five Rings, the Fantasy Flight version that has the proprietary dice and whatnot, it read to me like a mess. I read it, I'm like, geez, like who's going to run this? This is crazy. This is so complicated. There's so many different things moving here. Like there's no way this is going to run. Then I got the game and I got the starter set. And holy shit, is the starter set awesome. Like it does an amazing job of communicating. Here's what's awesome about these, the rules that drive this game, and here's why you're going to want to play it again. And I was completely wrong about that. The game is complex, and it's got a lot of different things moving in it, but you can communicate that in a way that newbies, both newbie DMs and newbie players, can completely understand. And it's a great game. It's really, really fun. It's to my money, the best implementation of the narrative dice mechanic that Fantasy Flight has tried so far, and it also has some really fun OSR sensibilities to it, in the sense that the play of that stuff at the table is really simplified. It relies a lot on adding a lot of story elements to it. Obviously, I mean, people might disagree with my assessment of that having some old school sensibilities to it, but I really felt that when I've run it. The handful of times. But anyway, I don't want to get distracted by talking about Five Rings, but I only mention that to say that there's ways to make even the most complicated and convoluted rules manageable at the table. You just got to figure out how to do that in bite-sized chunks. I'm going to do that with Rollmaster later this year. I still have Rollmaster on my list of games I want to run, and it's a bonkers complicated game, but I'm going to figure out a way to make that work using these rules. Using my rules, using pre-gens obviously, and slowly highlighting these things, the mechanics. I'm going to make that work. And I'm not going to include all the rules. Like, you don't necessarily need to do that. You just need to have enough of the rules to feature the stuff that you think makes that game particularly cool. You know, the rules, the setting, and then all those other rules. So, or the rules for writing. I'm conflating rules and rules here. The mechanics of the role-playing game applied in the context of the rules of running one-shots. So that's all 10 rules. A little shorter than my usual episodes, I guess. But I'll maybe at the ending, I'll go through those rules again. I'm going to let it percolate for the day now. And I'll come back and I'll do the outro and a summary of these rules as well, and see if there's anything further I have to add. All right, so I think that's it. 10 rules for setting up your one-shot RPG session. The rules, of course, are Rule 1, use a stranger's time well. So use your players' time well. Rule 2, give readers or your players a character they can root for. Rule 3, every character should want something. Rule 4, every sentence should reveal character or advance action. So every step or everything you include in the one-shot should move things forward or teach us more about these characters that the players are playing. Rule 5, start close to the end. Give us only the best part of this story. Only the stuff that really matters for the time that's allowed. Rule 6, be a sadist. Make bad things happen to these players so it can make it interesting and give them something to struggle against. Rule 7, write to please one person and have a voice when you're writing your one-shots. Rule 8, give as much info as soon as possible. To hell with suspense. Rule 9, include the very best parts of your setting in your one-shot to highlight the things you like best about that game or setting. And Rule 10, include the best mechanics that you like best about that game or setting. The things that really you think would come off the best in a one-shot. So that's it. 10 rules to help you make for a better one-shot. As always, if you have any comments, questions, or concerns regarding these 10 rules or anything else about one-shots, if you got rules that you think I've missed out on or I think I should add, please don't hesitate to leave me a message on Anchor, or you can reach me on Twitter at Dungeon Musings, or you can reach me on by email. The email address is dungeonmusings@gmail.com. And if you want to see some of these principles put in play, I do have 4 different charity one-shot sessions that'll be coming up in the coming months on the Dungeon Musings YouTube channel, so you can see those on there. Otherwise, as always, thanks so much for listening. And if I don't hear from you beforehand, happy gaming.
The podcast you just heard was made using Anchor. Ever thought about making your own podcast? Anchor makes it really easy for anyone to get started. It's a one-stop shop for recording, hosting, and distributing podcasts. Best of all, it's 100% free. Sign up now at anchor.fm/new. That's anchor.fm/new to get started.